Hey Islanders, and welcome to episode 30 of the Camano Voice. On this episode, I speak to old-time Camano folk. Please welcome Jim, Joyce, and Vince Muscolo. Hi, I'm Brandon Erickson, and you're listening to the Camano Voice podcast, where I interview folks around Camano Island and beyond. If you want to stay up to date on events, businesses, and even hear a little history of this area, subscribe to this podcast and share with your friends. Thanks for listening. Hey Islanders, and welcome to another episode of the Camano Voice, where we release a new episode every Tuesday. On this episode, I got to speak with Jim and Vince, who are both old-time Camano folk. Jim moved up here in the 1950s, and Vince shortly thereafter. And they just had some great stories of what Camano was like way back in the old days. So it's kind of the equivalent of when you just start talking to some people that have just been there, just older folk that have so many stories to tell. And so the pattern of this, I basically, for this interview, I just asked them a couple leading questions, and then I sat back and listened and just really enjoyed hearing the great stories they had to share. So I hope you guys really enjoy hearing about what Camano was like before it had electricity and power. Those are the same thing. Running water, any of those things, and before the island had really been touched at all by civilization, it seems like. So anyways, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jim and Vince. Hey Islanders, and welcome to another episode of the Camano Voice. Today I'm here with Vince Muscolo and Jim Joyce, old-time Camano folk. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, easy on the old-time thing, please. Jeez.
Well, before we hit record, you guys were kind of jumping into a story about how you guys met. Why don't we just start there?
Great. Go ahead, Jim. I think you started.
My parents moved up here in 1947 when I was just about 3. And back then there was nobody around, absolutely no other families around, no kids around. And it was just one day, I'm guessing maybe 48, we were just talking about that, maybe 49 at the latest. I looked up and there was this kid that walked through the woods, and I'd never seen that happen before. And so we just started talking, and Vince used to come up. He was the summertime, and in all reality, because there was nobody around, that was the thing I always look forward to. Because
wait, I thought it was because you liked this.
Well, that too. But
Jeez, really?
I like the dry salami your dad bought. I mean,
it was that.
They always bought dry salami. My parents never had that stuff.
Yeah, I think we introduced a few things that was new.
Yeah.
But you talk about coming through the woods as if it was a little thing.
Oh, that's right. It
was not a little thing. Well, we came to Camano Island from Seattle, and it was a place that we came on the weekends whenever we could, and then during the summer we came. I can get back to some dates and when that all started, but this particular day will live forever in my memory. And if it gets out into the public, I'm sure it'll become even more famous than that. And it could be made into a movie. It went like, so I get up, and as Jim said, there were no other people around. There were no other houses along the road. There was no electrical power coming into any of the houses because there was no power lines. The trees all touched over the road, and I loved it.
Yep.
And so I'm out there, and I hear this strange. I hear this kind of a noise, somebody moving or talking, and so I started to try to imitate a coyote. So I'm going, woo, 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 like that. And this voice answers me with sort of a shrill sort of a response. And it's coming from the woods that were on what's on the north side of our property. Now, our property's all treed anyway, but then the woods became, the untouched woods. And I'd been into the woods, 6-7 feet, looking and exploring and like that, but nothing any further than that. So I went over the edge of the woods, and I was barking, and then I'd hear this response, and then I'd go into the woods a little bit further, and I'd hear this kind of this shrill response again. And before you knew it, I was 20, 30 feet into the woods, and there was a bit of a game trail, and I kept going and yelling back and forth, and I broke out into a clearing. Much as it was, there weren't too many clearings around,
No.
but there was a clearing, and here was this other kid. I mean, another kid. This was
The Mott's
was
house was
marvelous.
still standing there, wasn't it?
Yes,
We didn't
yeah.
own the double lot then,
Yeah.
so there was another cabin by ours.
that had a bear skin rug on the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when that happened, as great a place as Camano Island was always to us, for me to come up here and on weekends and holidays, it became a lot more fun because Jim was up there, and we would do all these things that made Camano Island so great.
Now, when we're saying house too, that's nothing like the houses today. It was basically when we moved up there, as Min said, there was no electricity. We had no running water. It was basically a shack. It was about at most 800 square feet maybe, and it was just an open area. A little kitchen that had a sink and a wood stove. Even though there was no water, they could plug it. My mother could put water in there. She'd boil her out. And there were bunk beds. And there was my two sisters and me and my mom and dad. And then it took about 3 years. My dad expanded it out to maybe 1,000 square feet and a loft upstairs. And then we finally got electricity and water, I guess, in the early 50s, around 50, 51.
Okay.
And then finally, wow, there's a flushing toilet, that kind of stuff that really looked cool. So it's like you said, there wasn't anything. There was just trees and blackberry bushes and all kinds of, maybe you could find somewhere where a deer had gone through and made a deal. But yeah, it was quite different back then.
Wow.
Well, our home was in Seattle, and we had the Camano Island was the special place. My folks bought the piece of property there before I was born.
Okay.
They bought the piece of property in 1938.
Okay.
And my dad and my grandfather started building a cabin with leftover lumber. They bought all the framing lumber and part of the siding for $8.50 when they tore down the Grange Hall in Black Diamond, and they brought it up there and they built just like it's a few hundred square feet with a wood stove, and there was no electricity, and I say no running water, and that we loved it. Other kids, from Seattle, for example, would go there. They'd go to Mount Rainier. They'd go to Yellowstone. They'd go to the ocean. We didn't want to go anywhere else. We wanted to go to Camano. I mean, that's where the tree house was.
Yeah,
The
tree
BB
house.
gun was there. The rowboat was there. The bow and arrow you were working on was there. Why the heck would you want to go to, Mount Rainier or Yellowstone Park, for heaven's sakes? Didn't have anything there. But,
I used to remember looking over, finally, at times, you could look through the woods, and their light would be on a Friday night. And this was going to be the best weekend I ever had because their light was on. I was probably over there about 7 o'clock in the morning, like opening up Christmas presents, and his dad would be out on the deck, maybe shaving him. Hey, Jim, what's happening on Camano Island? And here I am, 5, 6 years old. I haven't got a clue, but I'll tell him stories just because. Wow, there's somebody asked me.
That was one of the things. Friday night was the way we would arrive often, and most memorable for me is in the wintertime because it would be dark, and my dad would go in the house. We'd wait in the car. He'd go in the house and start the fire in the wood stove and light up the kerosene lanterns and this and that before electricity came. But and then we'd get in the house and sort of get settled or just get in there. And my dad would say at some point, "Wonder how long it'll be before Jim gets here."
That's right.
And sure enough, he'd make it through the woods with the inevitable flashlight and whatever dog he had at the time. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, those are the fun times.
Yeah.
So you were living here full time then, Jim?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And you moved here, and then how long were you living here on the island?
Well, we moved up here and I don't know. I've always wanted to look that up over at Coopville. I do not know, but I think my parents purchased that lot probably pretty close to the same time in the early 40s, mid 40s at the latest. Even the war was on though. But my dad got a job with the Black Ball Ferry Line up at Anacortes. That was the predecessor to the Washington State Ferries.
Oh,
and
okay.
so we moved up here and then built from there. And we were here till about 1960. I think we got electricity right around 51, something like that. And then the phone finally came through in 57, a 16-party line, if you can believe that. And I think we finally got a television around 54 or 55. 2 stations is all you had. So, I mean, that was it. If you didn't go outside and do things, there was nothing to do. And we spent a lot of times in the woods, running around, exploring, whatever, with the BB guns, hunting for whatever, and then down to the beach. We go down there. The fall was the smelt time, and that was the biggest fun and everything else.
Nice.
Kids today would go, how boring. And I think that was the most disappointing thing.
Well, he's exactly right. It's not that there wasn't anything to do. There were lots of things to do. But, maybe by today's standards, they seem like, they don't seem that big. But as far as the rowboat on your own, and we were on our own. It wasn't, there weren't any parents hovering over us.
No.
You were sent out in the morning, and you went in the woods, and if you wanted to climb a tree, cut down a tree, shoot the BB gun, row out in the boat, that's what you did.
And that was the days when Disneyland first came out on their show. So there was Davy Crockett and all those kind of people. So we'd play that. Or you go down. I don't know how many nails I went through, and I take a hammer, and there would be driftwood there, and you'd make a raft, and you go out, and there were rafts floating all over the place because we were pushing the rafts around and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, Jim said that he was there because his father got the job with the ferries, and I remember that he was on the ferry boats, and I think your uncle was a captain on a.
He was
ferry
Coast
boat
Guard.
also?
He was
Oh,
Coast Guard. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember at one point going to see somebody on one of those boats, and so that's what brought him there. We're here, and I'm here today because of smelt.
Okay.
And the way it worked is that my parents lived in Seattle, and near us was a fellow, a very interesting gentleman named Otto Lehman of Lehman Road today. And Otto was talked to my dad often about this piece of property he had on Camano Island, where he had this dream of building a hunting and fishing lodge and bring people up from Seattle and or any place and have this business out at the end of civilization on Camano Island. So it was 1938 that he finally talked my father into coming up to Camano Island.
Okay.
And it was a 2.5+ hour drive from Seattle to get up here. And he came up what eventually became East Camano Drive later on, and going south on East Camano Drive, where Caballero Road is now, the road sort of petered out and became a logging road.
Okay.
But before you got there, he pointed at a chunk of woods. At this point, Jim's family wasn't there either.
No.
Pointed at this piece of woods and said, "Well, here's lot number 2, and this lot is available." And it was for sale for something like $350 if he was interested. And it was a little bit more than an acre. Part of it was on the bluff.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad and Otto said to my folks, and you get through the woods down to the bluff, there's a great view out there. So my dad and my mother started through the woods, and my dad ended up getting a stick, and they were beating down brush, and we're walking down through this trail through the woods to get to the brush, and there was no trail; it was just solid underbrush, and so they beat their way down there, and it had to be, it was 300-400 feet. I mean, isn't it more than that?
Yeah,
Jim?
yeah, probably.
Like that.
At least
anyway,
that, yeah.
They end up getting toward the edge of the bluff, and it's a beautiful view, all right, when you can see it. But they were scratched up, and mosquito bitten, and their clothes were torn, and this is untenable. How would you even manage this? So they've got went all the way back to the car, and drove down the road to where Otto was right on Lehman Drive is now, above where Driftwood Shore is now. And Otto was there, and my dad said, "Oh, Otto, thanks for the invitation, this and that. This is too much for us. It's too much of a trip. It's a lot of work clearing up there, and it looks like there might be a war coming on, and which would be difficult to maybe get away and get this and that." And my Otto said, "That's fine. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad you came anyway, but don't leave." Otto said, "Don't leave right now. We're going to go and catch some smelt." What? What's a smelt? "Oh, some smelt is some fish that come in down on the beach. It's all right. Come on down." So my dad and mother went down there, and sure enough, the smelt came in just like they were supposed to, and they raked smelt, and they cooked smelt, and they ate smelt, and the smelt came in some more, and they laughed, and they yelled, and they pointed, and they raked some more smelt. And at the end of all that, my dad said, maybe this wouldn't be such a bad idea. This is a lot of fun. And so he talked to Otto about it, and Otto said, "Well, if you can give me $20 and $10 a month when you can afford it, I'll sell you the piece of property." And that's why I'm here today.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know how my dad met Otto, but that shack was what they called the duck shack.
Okay.
And the same thing, and there was one right next to that was owned by a guy named Louis Motts. And my dad and Motts and another friend of my dad would come up and go duck hunting down there in Triangle Cove and everything else. And they got pictures of all these ducks hanging on the deck where they come up for the weekend and do it. But that was primarily what this was for, yeah. And then it got into the smelt and all the other good stuff.
Well, yeah, Driftwood Shores now, with all those houses one after another, that spit of land that sticks out there, that was a famous duck hunting place.
Oh, okay.
Layman's Spit.
Yeah, and they'd walk out there, and there would be ducks on both sides, and they'd fly back and forth. And I remember when they built the first cabin there on the beach, and that was a real interesting period, too, because they were really... they were rustic, in those days, recreational property for the affluent, that whole concept didn't exist.
Nope.
No, when you went out to the country, you had to be made of sterner stuff. You had to be willing to carry water, cut firewood, do without electricity, and this and that. So they built this first cabin down there, which now when I realize where it is, it's only about halfway out the spit. And my dad said, it won't last the first winter. The first storm will take the place out, and it just won't last. Well, it did last, and so there is Driftwood Shores today. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
It was funny, I can remember one of the earlier experiences as my parents built our house and they expanded it out. We went down, and Weyerhaeuser was there in Everett, so they'd have a storm, and the log booms would bust sometimes and stuff would come out. And we would get cedar logs and pull them into Layman's Beach with a rowboat, and then with a crosscut, cut them into lengths, and then bring them up to our house in the car, and then we would split them and make the shingle shakes or the cedar shakes for the side of the house. And then my dad got this ugliest yellow paint in the world, and he painted those things. And I was totally amazed when I came back here in '94 that old place was still standing, that those cedar shakes out of the salt water were still on the side of that house.
Wow.
And that ugly yellow was still there, and it's still there to this day in 2020 that he built back in 1950.
Wow.
Now, I think every termite that's ever visited Camano Island has passed through that over the years, because post and pier and everything else. And I'm sure if anybody ever inspected that, but to think that he did that, built that, he made the cabinets out of plywood by himself and did all the electrical and all the plumbing. But that's what you had to do, because you weren't going to go find a contractor, an electrician or a plumber. You'd be lucky to find them back then. You did things yourself. Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Done yourself. Yeah.
And then, like he said, lumber out of wherever you could get it for whatever price. And
There were a lot of interesting stuff. You
Yeah.
know, Otto built this marvelous big house that was going to be the lodge, and it was built out of an operation like Jim is talking about: cedar logs and logs coming in on the beach and being hauled up, and then sawed up into timbers. And he built this 3-story house that was always gray and driftwood color. It had a big porch with windows all the way around, and you know, maybe in my imagination and thinking back as a kid, it's bigger than it was. But to us,
yeah, it was. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, but it was the center point. When we came on the island, that was the first place that was a great big landmark.
Yeah.
And it was real important because that's where we went to get water, because we didn't have any water. And so we'd go up to the cabin. My dad had a big barrel, and then he had a whole bunch of glass gallons. And he'd put them in the back of the car or station wagon. We'd go down to the Lehmans, often at night, and knock on the door, and they'd open the door, and they had a well down there. And so we'd get water and bring the water back up. And,
Wow.
And Otto had brought several people from wherever he knew them, I think from Seattle, and brought them up to help him build and sort of install them around there. One was a fellow named Fred.
Fred Braun.
Fred Brown.
I don't know why that just came to me.
Well,
Yeah.
that's perfect, but Brown was not really his name.
No.
He had some German name that was unpronounceable, and he took the name Brown, if I remember correctly. But Fred used to build boats
Okay.
out of these same logs that Jim is talking about. And Jim had one of those. It was called a Fred built.
Yeah, a cedar boat. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can remember his hands were all scaly from working with that cedar all the time with no gloves, and it took forever to build it. But he built some really nice boats. Yeah.
Wow. So then, did you guys? How far out from where you guys is? I guess first of all, for pinpoint, where were you guys housed, like on the island then during that time?
Do you know where Thunder Ridge is?
Yeah.
Okay. If you come north of Thunder Ridge, I don't know, 600-800 feet tops.
Okay.
That's where he was on the one side. There's his cabin is still there.
Okay.
Been upgraded since,
A little bit.
but it's that was still there. And then it's about halfway between Thunder Ridge and where Patricia Ann Lehman Road is,
Yeah.
that intersection on the bluff. Yeah.
Okay. So then, how far out were you guys traveling on your daily adventures?
It seemed like 3 miles, but kids our age, like he said, going through the woods, you don't go very fast, and it takes you a while to go, and you wander around, and geez, we're pretty close to where we started, I think. I don't know.
Well, they were big. The woods were thick on both sides of both of our lots. And if I went toward Jim's, that was one set of woods there, and there was an old shack halfway between there that somebody had.
Yeah.
That somebody had built when they were either logging or doing something there. It had a little slanted roof, but it was just a little, like a storage shed.
Yeah.
And they had a security system to keep people from messing around with that shack. Do you remember what that was? They had written on the door in red paint, "Danger Dynamite."
I forgot about that too. I never ever saw anybody there ever.
And we never saw any dynamite either,
No, I
because
didn't
we
either.
were in there a lot. And we used to call it the Danger Dynamite Shack. But I said, and it wasn't until years later that I realized, wait a minute, whoever did that wanted to keep people out of there, or to keep kids out. They said, here's how we'll do it. We'll write Danger Dynamite on the door of the shack. So that's how that worked.
Now the only time it was kind of iffy, and my mother wouldn't let me go out that much then, was in October when the deer season would start.
Yeah.
Then the hunters would come up from Seattle, and some of them were road shooting, and that. So she said, "No, you're not going to go out there on the weekends and everything else." But other than that, there was never anybody around.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was different. But we had some basic activities that were really important that we came to Camano Island for: smelt, smelting was really big.
Yep.
Blackberry picking was really
Yes,
big.
yeah.
And mushroom picking was really big.
Okay.
Now, Jim just reminded me about that. And mushroom picking, you had to be real careful because it was hard up close to the hunting season.
Yeah.
And so we'd go mushroom picking and then all of a sudden say, no more mushroom picking. Tell the crazy hunters, get out of the woods.
And they liked the morels, and my dad liked the shaggy manes, the inky blackcaps. And,
Okay.
But yeah, I forgot. And the blackberries aren't those big ones that you see.
Oh,
Those
yeah.
are the real tiny little ones where they happen to be right around where the nettles are. So you got good old nettle stings and the stickers in you, and you go, wow, these berries are really worth it. And you'd pick for hours, and they just kind of squish on down.
At the end of the day, your hands would be all purple.
That's
And
right.
if you got in a really good spot, then the front of your clothes would all be purple, too. Now, do you remember the lady on the other side of the island that used to buy
Yeah.
blackberries?
Yeah.
Ruth?
I can't remember her name, but it was over in Madrona, just up from the yacht club. And in fact, when I got here, it used to be a cafe.
Okay.
On
And she
that side of the
yeah,
road.
Yeah, yeah. And then the other place that would buy them was up at the Turkey House up there by Conway.
Oh.
That's where we Jim Lindell and I used to do that, and it
So
was.
you actually sold. We always made pies and we ate them.
Yeah, I can't remember who told Jim and I to do that. So we did that, and we spent an awful lot of time picking just to make $4 or $5 on it because it's squished down. Okay, enough of that idea. But,
That's probably a good deal for them.
yeah, it was.
But that smelting thing was a moment in time, and I can remember when it was such that you went down at high tide, and the people were almost shoulder to shoulder from one and where we were always in the same area, which was basically below Jim's house and below our house.
Okay.
Which means you went down to that area which is now the county park at Caballero Road.
Yep.
And you walk north from there along the beach. And that area, the people just came from all over the island, or people that knew about it.
Yeah.
And they would be there, as I say, 3-4 feet apart.
Yeah.
And you were really protective of your little area. Give me room to operate here. And then you could just see the smelt coming down the beach. They'd be getting them down there, and then you'd be coming your way. They're coming our way. This and that, and lots of yelling.
It was a lot of boring, sitting around doing
Oh.
nothing, and all of a sudden those things would hit. And when they would hit, just like Vince was saying, and you were running, and I can remember once, it was during the week, my mother and I went down, and it was just the two of us. And we were going, so we were digging little potholes alongside Besser logs. We were throwing up in logs and going up and down.
By
And
hand?
yeah, and here's the doggone seagulls flying behind us. Oh, we're getting us out of the way. Just
That's
sweating.
right.
You just-
That's right. Yeah, the seagulls after it. Yeah.
Well, I remember because we used to live up on Tillicum Way,
Right,
right above Arrowhead Beach Road.
right.
And as a kid, I remember because we didn't my dad when he moved up here. I mean, our knowledge of this area and wildlife or anything up here was very little. And I remember being on the beach down there with some friends, and we didn't know what was going on, but we were down there just throwing rocks into the water, whatever. And all of a sudden, we hear some stuff going down along the water. And we're like, "What is that?" We're younger kids, so to us, we're thinking some sort of monsters coming
Yeah.
out, and we're like, "Okay, it went away." And then it's over here, and then it's they're everywhere, and we're like, "What are they?" And then we figured out they were fish, and we had no idea what else besides that.
The other thing that happened, we were here a couple of years and we came back in '94, and our nephews came up. They're the same age as our kids, so they were probably in their early 20s then. And we go down to the beach, and there was a stick. I picked up the stick, threw the rock in the air, and hit it, and it's like, wow, what'd you just do? Well, that's the only baseball, and that you
We used
had
to do
back
that. We used to do that for hours, by hours. And if you found a really good stick, you kind of want to keep it.
That's where you guard it.
Yeah.
And I can remember there was one other couple that lived there. They lived they built down below the bluff. Their name was Schindler, and they came up, and they had a daughter the same age as Vince. They come up once in a while too, but her older brother, and that was when Leo Lassen used to announce the Rainier baseball game, and he'd have the radio going on, and then we're down there with the sticks, throwing the bat. Yeah, we hit it, because I was making like, okay.
Hey, it was.
You do what you got to do.
It was a different time.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, I mean, that was how when we were up here, when we first moved up here, there wasn't a whole lot, a whole lot going on. So, like, my friends and I, we would do bike rides around the island. We'd spend a ton of time at, like, Utsalati Beach, right behind the little store by the bay. And we would do the same thing. We'd be sitting there hitting sticks.
And those things become more memorable than sort of some stylized thing or planned event. It just is. They really meant a lot.
Yeah.
As it happened.
There was a when you say that, it reminded me. I was in the 7th grade, and there was a new 8th grade teacher that was there, and he was just right out of Western. And he coached the football, the baseball, and basketball stuff. So it was in the spring, and he came down the hall, and he said to me, "Hey, you play baseball?" He said, "Well, why don't you turn out for baseball?" So I went on home, and I told my parents, "I got to play baseball because Mr. Ayers said I had to." And my dad thought I'd died and gone to heaven because he always wanted to play baseball. So he bought me a 3-speed English bicycle, which was big time then. And I rode my bike from there all the way up to the Lincoln Grade School, which is the senior center in San Juan. Now, that was 11 miles. Rode my bike in the morning, attended school, and then turned out for, I guess it was only an hour back then, and I'd have to ride my bike all the way back here. And I did that either 2 or 3 days in a row. And coming out of one of the practices, there was an 8th grader, and he walked with me down the hill through Stanwood. And then he stuck out his thumb, and a pickup stopped. And the guy said, "Hey, kid, you want to put your bicycle?" "Yeah, okay." So I put my bicycle in it, and he bought us out to Camano Hill Road. And I only had to go that short distance. So that was the last time I rode my bicycle to school. And I used to hitchhike home every night after that. And then even in the 8th grade, you hitchhiked and then in the 9th grade, the basketball practice was in the morning at 7 o'clock is when we got the gym. So I'd be out there at 6 in the morning, thumbing a ride to get all the way into Stanwood and back in the winter months. But yeah, that's how you got around back then too. If you want to go somewhere, you hitchhike.
And it worked.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, what were your guys's? So your parents, Jim, were working, or your dad was working with the ferry.
Right.
Vince, what was your parents doing?
Well, my dad had a business in Seattle. And they were manufacturing Venetian blinds and draperies and stuff like that for homes. And they had a little shop on Dearborn Street in Seattle, and they did that. I went to school there.
Okay.
But Seattle was sort of a place you had to be when you weren't at Camano. That was that's what we were looking forward to. Was what what was the schedule? Are we going this weekend, or something came up? We can't go to the island. So we'd go the next weekend, and then of course in the summer, then how early can we get up there? If the school's not out until whatever the 15th of June or whatever it was.
Yep.
Like that.
There was the other thing memory too. He mentioned that because his dad had it was either a 53 or 54 Ford station wagon.
Yeah, yeah.
And he came up, and when we were up here, then it was like, "Hey, you want to go to Utsalati to get an ice cream cone?" Because Utsalati's store was the only place.
Yeah.
So Vince and I and his sister would get on the tailgate of that station wagon, and his dad would drive us on down. And it seemed like he was going fast. I doubt very seriously he was going more than 20 miles an hour. When you're looking backwards, it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
But we'd ride all the way over there on the back of that tailgate, get our ice cream, and come on back, or to go down to the Lehman's. And I think about now, oh, geez, you got to be buckled up if you can breathe the car.
That was sort of any time that you had to go and it was that Jim was with us, or that we'd sit on the tailgate of the station wagon and go.
Yep.
My dad was he was in favor of ice cream cones. I don't think he had a problem with the proliferation of ice cream cones, and any slightest excuse to go for an ice cream cone was great, and that was terrific.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the way we did the blackberries and the mushrooms too. Is we ride out the tailgate and keep our eye open, and shout instructions as we went down the road.
Yeah, well, even when we first moved up here, again, there wasn't much going on.
Nope.
So we would ride in the back of my dad's pickup truck, like when we went to and from like the boat launch or anything that was based on the island. Like if it was summer, he would let us ride in the back of the truck, and we did that quite a bit.
You know, I think one of your little notes there was you said, what's one of the biggest changes? And I first noticed it when I came up in 94. I came back here, and then I started working in real estate. And people would buy and have their summer home and think the grandkids were going to come up and visit. And the grandkids would come up here and sit inside because it was so boring, and they'd watch television. And I was thinking, good golly, because back then you never thought of staying inside. You just, and your parents, like Vince said, get out of here. And there was nobody hovering over you. You're on your own. And I see it, you know, kids. And even my own son came back in the late 90s for a while, and he said, you know, I like you guys, but this place is boring. I'm going down to Seattle and find a place to work. And it was like, oh, man, this used to be...
It was a different kind of fun that I think was more realistic. There was the imagination part of
That's
it,
right.
and the creating of your own thing. I mean, climbing the tree and then imagining all the adventures that are around that, you know, whatever required you to climb the tree.
Yep.
Or we had a tree house, and often we'd sleep in the tree house overnight. And you know, the treehouse was, you know, 40 feet from the house, but still, we could have been at the, you know, in the middle of an uncharted wilderness, especially because you had a kerosene lantern or a candle, and
You know, you said that his dad just rolled, was almost crying. He was laughing so hard. He was out on the porch, and I came over early one morning, and Vernon said, "Shut up in the treehouse." So I went up in the treehouse, and there's these two sleeping bags, and I grabbed one. And Vince's sister, her head popped up, and she had one of her friends there. And he was in the house. His dad thought that was the funniest thing going.
Oh, that's right. You talked about that for a long time. I woke up two girls in the treehouse.
Now,
well.
did you guys build the treehouse, or
Yeah.
did your dad? Or
My dad did.
Okay.
My dad did. Yeah. And the lumber for the treehouse, he went up. There was a lot of little logging operations, and there was one right up the road, and they would take the logs, and when they started making the lumber, they'd rip down the sides, the round part off the sides as they're squaring up this log.
Yeah.
And so there was all this leftover stuff left there, all these sides. What do they call that stuff? Slag,
Yeah, I know what you're
slag,
talking about, yeah.
something like that. And so he took that down, and he had bolted his skill saw upside down, and he was running these through them to make the sides straight because they're all uneven because they come out of a log, and that's what he built the treehouse out of.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Oh, and the treehouse at one end had a dogwood tree that was close to it. That didn't have any branches on. The branches were higher, and the way you came down from the treehouse is you jumped onto this dogwood tree and slid down to the ground. That was the standard way to leave.
And when
the
we're
tree.
saying treehouse, it wasn't really a house. It was I don't know, probably 4 or 5 feet wide, and then had railings on both sides, and it was just basically platform between the two. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what and then
Houses-
the next one was a little more elaborate, but it was, you know, just something.
But it was called the tree house.
That's right,
You know,
yes.
even
That's
though
the way we
there was
refer to it.
There was nothing really house about it, other than that's what we called it, and so of course,
Yep.
that's how that went.
So then, Vince, then you guys would come up and visit and everything. When did you actually end up moving to the island, and how did that occur?
Well, we had a mutual friend that Jim mentioned earlier, Jim Lindell, and Jim Lindell was here on Camano Island building houses. He had started building houses when he was in high school, working for Ken Manning. Was it Ken Manning? Guy that, anyway, fellow that built a lot of the first houses down in the country club area.
Okay.
And anyway, Jim had been building houses, but he was also doing some commercial fishing. So I was working in Seattle at the time, and I had a little business making wooden products and things. And Jim would stop in and see me once in a while. But one day in the 72 or 73, he said, just offhand, he said, why don't you move up to Camano Island and help me build houses? He said, it looks like I'm going to be able to get a license to fish Bristol Bay in Alaska, and so I'll be gone in the summer, and we could be partners building houses. So that was it. I moved up permanently. We'd still been coming up on the weekends.
Okay.
And nothing had changed as far as coming up the weekends, except, of course, by this time I was married and I had 2 children. And so we sold our little house in Seattle and moved up to Camano Island, and I went to work with Jim.
Okay.
And we did that for a few years until he decided to fish full time, and then I continued building houses.
Okay.
And so that went on for about 40 years. A little.
Did you move to
something
the?
do.
You didn't move to the same property, right? You moved somewhere else?
Somewhere else, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so because my parents were there.
Okay.
Shortly after we moved up. My dad retired, and they moved up to the old what was sort of at that time somewhat remodeled cabin that he had built with my grandfather.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
So how did you end up meeting my dad, Jeff?
The way I met Jeff it's an interesting story. We'd been, I guess that's one of the things people say, right? It's a really interesting story.
Yeah, especially at our age.
Yeah. After I said it, I said, "Gee, that sounds kind of stupid." Can we erase any of that? Maybe later. Anyway, one of the things we'd observed going on, by this time we'd been there on Camano for 15, 18 years, in that neighborhood, been living here permanently. And so my wife came home one day and said, "Oh my gosh, I just heard another idea about Terry's Corner." So Terry's Corner was this place well known now here on Camano Island. When I was a kid, Mr. Terry had the dairy farm here, and it was very, very, Mr. Terry was a contact influential, because if you knew Mr. Terry, you could go down there and get really great manure to bring up for your garden, which my dad did. And then, after we'd moved up, we'd heard over this 15 years or so, different schemes that were announced either in the newspaper or rumors, or you heard about real estate people talking about something going on, and there was going to be a store, it was going to be a post office, it was going to be a gas station and a convenience store, and none of this stuff ever materialized.
Right.
And so my wife came home and said, I was down at Elger grocery store, and there's a guy down there with another scheme for Driftwood, for Terry's Corner, and we laughed. Yeah. And he said, "Oh yeah, he's gonna sell coffee, and he's gonna have a restaurant down there and all that." And Terry's Corner was blackberry bushes and swampy ground.
Yep.
And so we had a good laugh about that. And then I heard more and more about this thing coming together. And by this time, I had gotten myself involved with the county or helping people who wanted to get some things done through the county as far as permitting was concerned. I'd been doing that I started doing it for other contractors while building. And anyway, I'd been doing that for several years and had gotten to know people at the county. So your dad called me and said, "Gee, could you come down and meet? We're going to try to talk about how we can get this thing permitted." And I came down, and he had brought a group of folks together, and we talked, and that's how we met.
Okay. So I want to go back real quick. Can you, just because it's such a well-known name and yet nobody knows anything about him, can you talk a little bit about like what you remember of Terry from the farmer and what that was like back then?
Well, I didn't know. I was in the cows in the Mr. Terry day. I was just a little kid, and I was more interested in the BB gun in the treehouse than going to get sacks of manure and bringing them home. That, much as I say we were, looking for fun in the outdoors, that was probably real low on the list.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of, I think, subsistence farms, operations on the island that have disappeared now, and that was one of them, and I think it was a bigger one, and I think he was a. Did you know anything more about him?
No, other than just this was a landmark, and he had the big farm down here. And I know one other side note of that I'll mention before I forget. In this area somewhere was a big strawberry farm.
Okay.
And it was owned by a guy named Willard Austin. And I can remember my sisters were both older than me. They used to pick strawberries for him. Well, he sold in 1957, and he went down to Bothell. And at that main intersection in Bothell, where the Bothell-Everett Highway comes down, and you got the one going to Lake Stevens, he bought a little hamburger drive-in spot, and it was called the Bothell Freeze back then. And so when we left here in 1960, and then in my junior year, in 61, I got a job working there. And that's when I found out, yeah, we used to live on Camano Island. We used to own the dairy farm, and your sister worked for us. So he then sold that to his son. They changed it to the Ranch Drive-In. His son passed it on to his son. And so that thing has been standing there since 1957. And it's still competing against the McDonald's and the Burger King and everything else, and still doing very, very well, still packing them in there. And that was a guy, that started up here. It was another one of the names, but I never knew Terry. Like Vince said, just that was the Terry that was the big farm, like Christofferson's had the other big farm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. This is cool. All the different things.
Strawberry picking. That was something that kids did, and my kids. I had 3 boys. The 2 older boys got involved with strawberry picking, and the way it worked is you went to some central location, and the farms at that time weren't in Stanwood anymore. By that time, they were on the frontage road on the way up toward Conway, and so the bus would take them out to the field, and they would get these baskets, and they would go out to pick the strawberries. Well, that got boring after a while, and they would eat a lot of strawberries, and then of
Throw
course,
the rotten ones at each other.
and then they would start throwing strawberries at each other, and that got something less than productive, and so. Anyway, they would do that. They'd try to keep them busy all day and try to get any strawberries from them. At the end of the day, they'd go and turn their strawberries in, and they wouldn't have very many strawberries. I mean, they'd have a few strawberries, and so maybe they'd earn $4.50 or $2.10 or something. But the lady that was running the operation, before they got on the bus, she took them over to a table where she had candy bars for sale, and by the time they got home, all they had were clothes that were all full of strawberry stains, little or no money, and the downside was they'd usually lost a jacket. My wife used to say it was not a money-making deal at all. Just replacing the jackets was expensive. So, strawberry picking. And the other thing I heard about, what I never really understood how that worked. It always sounded strange and mysterious that kids did, and it was called roguing spinach. It involved lying on the wings of a tractor and doing something to spinach plants as you passed over the top of them. But 2 friends of my children did that, and I thought maybe in the future I'd find out. I was hoping Jim would tell me something. But, yeah.
Well, see, I was only 16 when we moved out of here in 1960, and I didn't come back until 1994. So that's a 34-year gap. So when I come back, don't you remember? You grew up here. No, because there was that gap. That, when you're 16, you finally drive a car. That's when you actually start to get out and know these different places and everything. But so there was that long gap in here. I don't have any knowledge of her. He's much more knowledgeable about this place than I am.
And how did you, Jim, meet my dad?
I was at the Windermere Dan Garrison office at that time at the country club. And he walked in looking for another agent who had left the company. And so I talked to him, and then we drove around looking. I think he was looking for property for his father.
Oh, okay.
Initially. And then I don't remember. I sold a couple different things to him, and I remember he had real estate. He'd come talk to me a little bit about it. But I was trying to think when he started this at Terry's Corner here and everything. I just remember, and I think it was somebody in the office came up and said, "Hey, there's these lattes down there at the Alger Bay store." So I had one, and then I found out it was Jeff's. But it was when he had something down here, and he had the little Christmas shop.
Yep.
And I remember going into the Christmas shop, and he said, "Hey, come here, I got to show you something." You know, whenever your dad says, "You got to show you," look out. And so he introduced me to the frozen explosions.
Yep.
And then he shifted from as I started getting those down there at Alger Bay, then the young gal said, "You got to try white chocolate." So I did, and that got me addicted to them 20 some odd years ago. And then it was the eggnog ones.
Yep.
So it was back in the 90s when I first met him, but I'm not sure when I got the connection here. But I just remember going to his Christmas stores every year. We would go there and look around for the knickknacks and everything else.
Yep. Well, I see, Vince, you still have notes on your paper. Have we hit what you've had written down?
Oh no, I had just when I looked through your list of some kind of suggestions, you were talking about interesting people.
Yeah.
And so on a sad note, some of the great people that I remember that were so characteristic of the Camano Island, I remembered in those early days we were talking about. Of course they're gone now, but they were really Otto Lehman and his wife Peggy. With that dream that they had of building this lodge, and then they owned all that property that's now Driftwood Shores and the property on the other side of the road.
Wow. Okay.
Oh yeah, and they owned that property all the way from Caballero Road all the way down there, and he was quite a guy, quite an ambitious guy, and he had Fred Brown up that was building the boats, and he had brought his brother up,
Gus.
and Gus Lehman, and Gus was a character of the highest magnitude. He had an old house down there right by Triangle Cove, and two stories about Gus. I was a little guy, so I'm 7 years old or something like that, going around with my dad, and he said, I got to go see this guy Fred because I got to talk to him about something. So we go down there, and my dad starts to talking, and I'm looking around, and he's got this a corral thing with some animals in there. And so he comes over, and so I got this pig, and this is really a mean pig. This pig is sleeping there, and this is really a mean pig. Let me show you. So he gets a sharp stick and pokes this pig with this stick, and the pig gets up. And you see how mean that pig is? And I can remember my dad driving away, and my dad's laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "Of course it's a mean pig. He's poking it with a mean stick every time anybody stops by." But the reason we had stopped there is that my dad wanted to talk to him about serious business. So he said, "Fred, I'm building the cabin up there with my father-in-law, which is my grandfather, and they wanted to do a little bit of something. And he said, I need a beam. I need a wooden beam that's 12 by 8 or 12 by 12, big beam. This is not foundation building in those days. I need this beam, and I need it to be 18, 20 feet long." And Fred used to patrol the beach, and so he would have access to this kind of stuff. Oh, okay. So, so Fred said, "Gee, I don't have anything right now. How long do you need it?" So my dad told him the length, and Fred said, "Well, wait a minute. How about that beam over there?" So he's pointing at his house was up on stilts, Fred's house. So he's pointing at a beam that's holding up his house. And my dad said, "Yeah, a beam like that would be fine." Well, Fred said, "No, I mean that beam." "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I got house jacks. I could get that out of there." "Wait, no, that would be too much trouble." He said, "No, I'll get another one. It's not a problem." And so my dad said, "Well, I suppose that's all right. How much would that be?" And Fred said, "Would $5 be too much?" And my dad said, "Would you deliver it?" And Fred said, "Oh, sure." So that's where the beam came from. That's on the north side of was on the north side of our cabin from Fred, and that was Fred Lehman.
Oh.
So
I remember Gus had 2 raccoons as pets.
not Fred, Gus. Oh
Gus,
yeah.
And my dad would stop by to see him now and then, and he used to make wine all the time. And so he said to my dad, "Hey, I got this really good stuff." So my dad, okay, so it was brandy. It was like, whoa. Yeah, Gus. But if I recall right, all of them, they were under a watch because they were German during the war. I think my dad said, and they had to more or less say where their whereabouts, where they were going to go for a period. And I was thinking that they had come from Germany, like in the 20s or 30s. Maybe I'm wrong. I got something all screwed up in my brain.
No, that's I never
But
heard that.
I know that they had to be notify if they were going to leave any of this area.
Okay.
For any significant.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not down to Seattle, not a problem. But if they were going to go outside the state
Yeah.
or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, you get a little touch of history there, and I don't remember it, but I remember my folks talking about when they came to Camano Island.
Yeah.
They had to be careful about having lights on at night because of the blackout business.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so those were the war years.
Yeah.
And that impacted. I mean, all that stuff.
But see, one of the things there about that is that both our parents and a lot of the other people around here had lived through the Depression era.
Okay.
And then they'd lived through the World War II era. And the World War II era, even here in the state, there was a lot of rationing of stuff. There was a lot of doing without stuff because of the war effort. And so you got used to getting by on a little. And they never, my parents never really got over that kind of stuff. They still watched everything through the 50s because you never know when something's going to happen.
Yeah.
You never know when something's going to happen. And that
Yeah.
was their attitude. And so there was no extravagant stuff like there is now.
And I think that's why so many families look forward to and were willing to live, enjoy the rusticness of it. Because those beach cabins, the first cabins that appeared in Driftwood Shores and Tillicum Beach and Tyee Beach and those places, they were all pretty humble arrangements. They were driftwood and corrugated metal, and you came up with a few tools and a case of beer, and that's whatever they built that weekend. That was part of the cabin.
I can remember in over Madrona, I listed a house. It was in one of those beachy places, and the parents had passed on, and the kids couldn't afford to buy it. There was brothers and sisters; they couldn't, so they had to sell it as a family. And you walked into that thing, and the older sister listed it, and she was really teary-eyed. And up on the wall, all you saw were these pictures of all these families, all the kids. And she says, I can remember this whole floor would just be sleeping bags in the summer because our friends from Seattle, our cousins from Seattle, would come up for the big weekend and do it on 4th of July, all those things. And she said, my kids will never experience that because I can't afford to have something like this and do it. And that was the way it was back in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the rusticness, I think Jim is exactly right. I never thought of it that way, but being a product of the Depression and then the war years, having to do without running water for a while, not that happened, but that you had the idea that you could get by, and that maybe even there would be a few laughs and a little bit of enjoyment out of being close to nature and doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. My mother always used to. We had a generator, an old World War II Army generator that my dad got. So we'd run that a certain amount of hours a day to do some of the cooking and some of the other stuff. And on the radio, I would listen to the old radio shows back then. There was some kind of mystery show, I don't know whatever. And my mother was ironing and everything else, and she said, "Well, would you go turn the generator off?" And it was a commercial. So I ran out there, turned the generator off, ran back in the house. Never did hear the end of the program, But that's, but the rest of the time it was the kerosene lanterns at night and all other stuff and the wood stoves and
Yeah. All right. Well, I like to end every podcast with some rapid fire questions. So the first one is: do you have a lesser known or favorite location on Camano Island that you like to hang out?
Knowing it's going to be known now.
Yeah, right. Are we supposed to say the marketplace? Is that? Are we supposed to say?
No.
Mine goes back to because of all the memories. I live at the south end of the country club now. I like to go down on the beach. And I go down to the beach 3 where there's no houses around every now and then, and just walk the beach, just sit on the beach on the logs, and like I did as a kid, when the seals would come by or the loons would come by. It's just quiet. So those, and then another one that we'd go to over English Boom and look there because very few people, but those are kind of my favorite spots.
I've got to agree 100%. If the spot that comes to mind to me is that area of the beach, north of where the county park is now at Caballero.
Yeah.
When I walk that
too.
beach, it's exactly like it was when we were kids and I was there with my dad.
Isn't it amazing?
Exactly the same. There's no houses there. The same. The driftwood pattern is the same. The trees hanging over, and you can walk and walk and walk, and the beach is the same.
But you notice the rocks shrunk because they used to be so hard to climb up on top of.
They were bigger rocks.
Now they're only about 4 feet high, but back then, whoa.
Yeah.
Big boulders.
Yeah. Well, he's so old, he's seeing geological changes, wearing out of nature.
Yeah.
And that sort of
No,
thing.
you're right.
But those are the places that I remember that's special for me.
Yeah. Pretend you have a friend from coming in from out of town to Camano Island. What would the first day look like here?
The day look like for them, you mean?
Yeah, like if you were taking them basically on a tour.
It depends on their interests.
Yeah.
But I think we gravitate toward the water and toward the beach. And again, it depends on the time of the year.
Yeah.
One of the things from the south end is we say, okay, we'll drive around the head of the island. That's sort of a standard trip. It's short and it's it's interesting in that you're traveling south for a while and you make a little turn and then you're traveling north and the water's on one side and it's on the other side and of course there's some beautiful shots of the view and that's big for people.
Yeah.
It's kind of an easy one because we do it so much. And my wife grew up in Redmond pre-Microsoft.
Okay.
So she really likes this place up here too, and she likes to go for drives. So whenever anybody comes up, we go in the car, or even when we just come back from shopping somewhere, we have to turn at Cascade Lumber, and we have to go all the way around through Utsalati and down the west side. And if we're not in any hurry, we'll go all the way down to the south end and around. If we're in kind of a hurry, we'll cut at the Alger Bay store to go over. But just drive around the island. It just, because a lot of people, there's a lot of changes between north end and south end and east side and west side and everything, even though there's more houses. But, yeah, we just tour around the island.
Yeah. All right. Who's an interesting or fascinating person in this community that I should interview next?
Boy, there's lots of
Yeah.
people. I stopped and talked to Jim on our way in here, and because I thought about that question, and a lot of the really people I remember as being interesting and listening to them talk and hear stories, they're gone. So they were the fishermen that went every year to Alaska that we heard about. The people that were involved in logging. There was a whole Garrison family that were involved in logging in the early days of what they call Jippo logging operations, and that was interesting. So, but Ted Snowden. I don't know that Ted Snowden is around, but Don Simonson would be interesting.
Yeah.
Don Simonson's father used to be the building inspector on the island, and Jim told me something the other day that Don Simonson said about his father. Oh, and that's another story too, that he used to go out and paint the bomb targets.
Yeah.
What are the bomb targets? Well, go ahead.
I'm sure they're probably off of Barnum's Point. It seems like from our house they were further out. But they were just big pilings out there, and I don't think there was anything on it other than they were just big pilings. And then it was during the war. They had the bombers up at Woodby, the old
Yep.
prop ones, and they would fly over and drop these sandbags or stuff, dummy stuff, on try to hit these doggone bomb targets.
Whoa.
And they were just stuck out there. And I remember I came back, and I thought, my God, they're still there.
Still
but I
there.
think it was a channel marker. Maybe it wasn't.
No,
they
no,
were still there.
Yeah. They were, when I was growing up, those were the bomb targets.
Yeah.
And when my earliest, well, I got one of my absolute earliest memories of Camano Island that I can identify, and that's walking with my dad, like hand in hand,
Yeah.
from the cabin, walking down toward the bank. And he said, we're gonna go watch the airplanes. We're gonna watch them bomb. And I can remember walking, and I can remember hearing the airplanes, but then I don't remember any more about it. I don't remember what any of that was like. But all the time we were looking out there, we're always looking out. That was a landmark out there,
Yeah.
way out there, but pilings that were sticking up. And at one time there was some kind of wooden framework or something on there. And Mrs. Lehman used to tell us that there was a family that used to come up every year and because Lehman's was the only house there,
Okay.
and they would stop and talk to Peggy and Otto because their son had lost his life there as a bomber pilot. You know, something
Probably made a run,
happened
didn't
during
pull
a
out, yeah.
bombing run, and he was out. He lost his life there, and they never recovered the plane, and they never recovered anything.
Yeah.
So that was kind of serious stuff.
Yeah.
Serious stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Don Simonson would be somebody.
Yep.
The other thing I think about is people that grew up on the beach, because see, that was a different kind of a society thing. They say they were summer people on the beach. We were summer people up on the hill in the woods. Then there were the summer people down on the beach. And so I think about Timmermans. There was Don Timmerman.
Because he was way back during the time.
Yeah, Don Timmerman and Glenna.
Yeah.
They were on Driftwood Shores. And then over on Arrowhead, not Arrowhead, over on Iverson, down there below Mole Road, what is that?
Yeah,
Down there,
that's
Long Beach.
Iverson's.
Iverson Beach.
It's now called Long Beach.
That's John, the fellow that has the coffee. Is it Fitzpatrick? And Gay?
Oh, Kirkpatrick.
Kirkpatrick.
Yeah.
Now they both of those people met in that summer relationship on the island. Both Timmerman
Oh, okay.
and Glenna. What is it?
It's Gay and
Gay. Yeah, Gay and John. And Don and Glenna Timmerman. They would be interesting. You know, another one would be Bruce Almo. He doesn't live on the island anymore, but he grew up on the island, and he could tell you stories about his father. Now, if he told you stories about his father, John Almo, those would be stories.
Yeah, Bruce would be hard to get to because he works at it. But along that line, old Donnie Watkins can probably tell a lot because his dad put in about every septic system there was back here in the 30s, 40s.
There's Dwayne Colby. Dwayne Colby had a marvelous career in the Navy, and you know, is by Jim's standard a recent newcomer, but Dwayne would be interesting, as would John Dean, of course.
I'm just writing all those names down.
Yeah, Bill Keller is from my era, and Bill started coming up. They had a summer place over there by the yacht club boat launch, right on the water there, in the real early 50s. And
Okay.
he came up all the time, and then he moved up here permanently in 57. So there's a guy to give you a perspective about that west side Madrona area, all during the summer and everything else.
There's Teresa Garrison, who grew up on the beach, and she would be interesting.
She can tell you a lot of stories.
Yeah, you bet.
All right.
Jack Gunther.
Yeah. He's on my list.
Yeah, he's kind of
And then-
shy, you know, he might not say anything.
Then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, Dan Leon was born and raised in Stanwood and then spent his whole life here on Camano Island. But Dan knows a lot of the family people around here in the Stanwood and the Camano, the old family areas, and when stuff got going.
Okay. Very cool. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'll be reaching out to figure out how to get hold of these people.
Yeah.
All right. And lastly, if you guys could have a billboard on Camano Island right as you're driving on the island, what would that say?
I think it should say Jim Joyce lives here.
That's right.
I think that would be really nice and inviting.
You know, I put some thought about it just because of what he and I have talked about and everything else and what we see. And I think I would say, think about what you change before you change it.
Ooh.
Because once it's gone, it's gone. And there's a lot of stuff that, you know, why did we do that?
Absolutely.
That is,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Sometimes, well, the things that we remember that are so valuable and so colorful and living in our memory are gone.
Yeah.
Some of it are people, but some of it are places and attitudes and that kind of thing.
And one I'll really give credit to, because working on that Veterans Memorial in Stanwood, and I got to know Richard and Robin Hanks real well. They run they're the president of the Historical Society, and they've only been up here 4 or 5 years, but they have gotten so entrenched in pulling up all that history of this area and everything, along with Bill Blanding. And it's amazing how much they know about how Stanwood got started and how the other things, and then what took place out here on the island and stuff. So it's almost embarrassing when I look back and think, golly, they've only been here 4 or 5 years, and they know light years ahead of this stuff what I've ever learned. And when they start talking about, don't you remember that was there? Oh, another guy. Oh, come on now.
You go like this.
I know, I'm at that age. Good golly, he was a teacher here forever, and they just named the museum after him. Dave. Oh, I'm so embarrassed.
Oh, Dave. Oh, sure.
The teacher.
And yeah, I'll have it in a minute after
He
we leave.
was on the island. They moved into Stanwood. He knows so much of the Stanwood area and everything else when we go around. He's really interesting to talk to. Oh, I'm going to be so bad. That's the problem when you get to be our age.
I do this all the time anyway, so I don't know what I'll do when I'm older. All right. Well, when you guys think of it, I'll edit it in, or I'll put it in the show notes or something.
Absolutely.
But guys, thank you so much for coming out today. People can't see this obviously, but it was a snowstorm for you guys to get here and make this happen. So I'm so glad you guys made it out here.
Well, it was a hardship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm in the south.
Like the
end,
old
and
days.
we're still in hardship down there in the south end compared to you guys.
That's
in the
true.
north.
I was going to pedal my bicycle.
You have
You know, you got a lot of thanks to Splendy or whatever the name of that company was, because until they came through and cleared a lot of the trees back away from the power lines and the limbs off, every time the wind would go, you'd lose your power.
Absolutely. And we got so that we liked that too, by the way. That was kind of funny. We had the traditional kerosene lanterns, and the kids didn't mind it. Everybody had their flashlight, and then, anyway.
We always thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah.
It was something fun
Yeah.
as a kid. Like, it's something
Yeah.
different. The TV's
Exactly.
off. It's quiet. And you guys just have to hang out. We would play card games and stuff. It was
Yeah.
fun. So
Golly, I feel so stupid. I can't remember.
I'm going to have it here. Danubio.
No. Danubio was a teacher, but no, this guy.
It was a Dave Danubio, right?
Yeah,
And he was a school teacher.
Yeah.
How many? Those are the hints you gave me.
But golly.
I can't help you then. Because I was off on the Danubio side.
He's the brain power of the Historical Society for years. He is to the Historical Society what Jeannie Ovenall used to be to the food bank. If you want to know anything, they had it right there in their brains.
Do you remember that gal that used to have the Grange at the south end of the island? That used to come around to the beaches and teach the kids artificial respiration? Big
No, I don't
gal.
remember that one.
Joy Church.
But I do remember we came back. We hadn't been here a year or two. For some reason, there was something going on at the Grange, and I walked in the Grange. Like, good God, we used to roller skate in this little place. I mean, it's so tiny, and I can remember being on the tail end of that whip, being whipped around there, and thinking that was the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Are we
the
still live?
opportunity.
Yeah, we're still live.
Because we're,
Oh, this is the off-record drop that you're in trouble with.
yes.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And Islanders, I will talk to you on the next one. Well, a big thank you to Vince and Jim for joining me on the podcast today, and thank you for listening. If you haven't already, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. And for more information on this episode or previous episodes, go to CamanoCommons.com/podcast. That's CamanoCommons.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.